Greetings. My name is Brian Warnick. I'm Associate Editor for Educational Theory. Educational Theory is a venue in which we try to explore educational questions in all their appropriate depth and complexity, their moral, aesthetic, and epistemic complexity. Here we're joined by Kirsten Welch of Teachers College, Columbia University. She wrote a recent article in Ed Theory, Misplaced Tolerance and Educating for Intellectual Humility, which was published in February 2022. This article identifies an important mismatch between how we think about tolerance and our goal of trying to perpetuate educational humility in students. I was really intrigued by this article, and I think it's really important in our time and day to think about epistemic humility and how we can you think about this as an educational virtue and ideal moving forward. So Kirsten, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to study this topic?
Sure. So first of all, Brian, thanks so much for speaking with me today. I've been looking forward to it. So I'm currently just finished my fourth year in the PhD program in philosophy of education at Columbia Teachers College. And as far as this article goes, it's been a project that's had many different iterations and been in the making for a long time. I have been interested in character education and then the related philosophical topics of virtue ethics, virtue epistemology, for quite a while now. And I was in my master's program in philosophy at Western Michigan University and was teaching undergraduate philosophy classes there. And in those classes, I began to notice some really interesting language that my students were using. They would say things like, very frequently say things like, this is just my personal opinion, and then go on to express their view, or, this is just me, I just feel like, and go on to make a claim. And what struck me about a lot of those statements is that what they ended up saying after those introductory words were not just opinions, were not just feelings. They were articulating really substantial claims, but they didn't want those ideas to come across as substantial claims. And as I talk to other teachers, a lot of people would say, yeah, this happens all the time to me, and I get really frustrated by it because I really want my students to make some claims. So I began thinking about that experience in light of some of the philosophical and educational material I was reading about cultivating intellectual virtues and things along those lines, and thought that it would be worth trying to figure out what might be going on here. And in the article, what I try to do is offer one possible, at least partial diagnosis for that particular scenario. Again, it's not, I think the motivation students might have to use that sort of language in inappropriate ways can be very complex. And what I'm trying to do in this article is suggest that just perhaps one motivation might be a confusion of genuine intellectual humility with tolerance. And in the article, I argue that both tolerance and intellectual humility are extremely important and valuable, but we run into a problem when we conflate the two.
So why don't you give us an overview of the argument and where this conflation exists and why it's problematic?
Sure. So in a nutshell, what I try to do is explain the way in which intellectual humility is a distinctively intellectual virtue. And one of the main points I draw out in trying to do that is that intellectual humility has a motivational component. Its specific motivation, which it shares with all intellectual virtues, is a pursuit of truth, or I use a phrase from Linda Zagzebski, who calls it cognitive contact with reality. You're trying to understand reality better. Tolerance, on the other hand, is not an intellectual virtue. I identify it as a civic virtue, because when we're advocating for tolerance, we're trying to cultivate tolerance. The motivation is not necessarily trying to grasp the truth better. It's trying to further a good, stable society in which people of many different convictions and lifestyles can flourish together. Both extremely good motivations and very important. But what I go on to argue is that when we begin to treat tolerance as an intellectual virtue instead of a civic virtue, it can actually become an obstacle to the cultivation of genuine intellectual humility because of the conflation of those motivations. That's a very brief overview.
Yeah, that's great. I really like this idea of not only exploring the intellectual virtue, but also specific obstacles that we face as we try to actualize that virtue. It's like taking the analysis of intellectual virtue, I think, to a new level, which is just really exciting work. So what audiences do you think that this article might be helpful for? What impact do you want this article to have?
I think there's at least a few audiences I hope that this article might be helpful for. One, of course, is scholars working on intellectual virtues, educating for intellectual virtues. I hope I was able to contribute at least something to the conversation on that. But I also really hope, this is an academic article, so it likely won't find its way into the hands of teachers, but I do hope that the ideas might somehow trickle down and be relevant for teachers, because the last section of the paper, I try to offer some very sort of broad, just preliminary recommendations for what it might look like to address this obstacle of misplaced tolerance in attempts to cultivate intellectual humility. And those words really are directed towards teachers, whether at the college level or at the K-12 level. And I really do hope that this article and the work I do in the future is not directed only towards a scholarly community, but also towards the people who are actually doing the work of educating.
That's one thing that impressed me with the article, is that it does offer some concrete suggestions for teachers in the classroom to how to navigate this tension, perhaps between tolerance and epistemic humility. So I think it will be really useful to practitioners if it can somehow get out there and trickle down to them somehow. So what new questions did this open up for you, and what new directions do you see in your own work kind of growing out of this?
Sure. Well, related to what we were just talking about, I think the biggest question I had as I was finishing up work on this particular project was how do you go about cultivating intellectual humility and tolerance, and how those two things might work together. I offer some recommendations at the end of the paper, but they're largely speculative. I would love to do some work or draw on research that might test some of these things out, or perhaps do some field work, go into some schools and see what it might actually look like for educators to put these sorts of things into practice. So I think that's the biggest thing, is gaining a better understanding of what these strategies look like in practice, and in light of that, what better or worse approaches to the cultivation of intellectual virtues might be.
Well, fantastic. I wish you well in that, and I'm excited to watch your work moving forward. I do think we need more nuanced visions of tolerance, and also we certainly need more epistemic humility in order to confront the social problems I think that we're currently facing. So you're doing important work here. Kirsten, thank you for joining us. We'll put a link to your article up in the description of the article. And I invite everyone to read it and to learn from it. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Brian.